So I'm really pleased to welcome 6 guests to Fold'em today. They're all people who are really committed to helping others, to address gambling problems, and to be advocates and sort of raise awareness about this issue. And they come well prepared to do that. They all bring their own experiences with this problem. And they all are hosts of other podcasts that are out there addressing gambling problems. And for 2, they also have a YouTube channel. So welcome to Fold'em.
Thanks.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And so why don't we just get started? For each of you, just take a few minutes just to introduce yourself and to tell the listeners something about your podcast. And so, Jamie, why don't you go first? And Stephen, you can go next after that.
Sure. I'm Jamie Salisbury. I'm the host of the After Gambling podcast. And it's a podcast I started about 5 years ago and just sort of sharing my story. I was a poker player. I really struggled with gambling quite a bit in my 20s, and then found my way to GA and started to get help. But when I was there, I started to realize there were a lot of people that would come in the doors and then would leave and maybe never return. Or they were like me and just were probably never going to go through the doors unless somebody pushed them in. And I was a big podcast listener. So just really liked that format. And so I figured I actually listened to another person that's going to be speaking a little bit later and heard their podcast. And it definitely triggered the thought that, yeah, this is really helpful for me, and just wanted to start sharing. So shared a lot of it's my story. I interview some guests and really just try to talk about this addiction in a way that is kind of comfortable for people. And I always say you can just put it in your earbuds and nobody has to know what you're listening to, but that's really a big part of it.
Fantastic. Oh, Stephen next, and then Brian.
Hi, I'm Steve Delaney. I'm the host of the Fantasy or Reality, the GPP podcast. I started doing this about a little over a year ago. I was inspired by a few people in this group. I'm a little bit newer to recovery than some of the people in here. I've got 19 months bet free. And the first thing I found when I entered into my recovery were the podcasts of several people in this episode with us here. So I found them to be very inspirational. I found them to really help me early on in my recovery, along with going to GA meetings and online Zoom groups and one-on-one therapy. But I found podcasting to be really, really helpful for myself. And that's why after about 6 months, I just decided to start my own, because I just wanted to give back. I felt like I gained so much through this podcasting community. And I just wanted to pay it forward. So I used to be a daily fantasy gambler for about 4 years. I've had drug addictions in the past. So off and on for a lot of my life, I've struggled with addiction, but I've been clean for over 13 years and bet free for 19 months now. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really happy you joined us too, and that you jumped in with your podcast.
Thank
So
you.
Brian Ward, because we've got 2 Brians.
Yeah, my name is Brian Ward. I'm the host of Voices, the podcast. I'm also a certified gambling recovery mentor serving in the state of Oregon. And so one of the kind of prime aspects of my job is to help people discover their journey through recovery. And I found that a lot of times that was about finding different sorts of pathways and programs. And so I had this idea to explore the different programs of recovery by having representatives from those programs come on and talk about those programs and what they kind of took for it, to try to raise some awareness around how many options there could be. So we're just about to go into season 4. They're very short seasons. They are typically about 6 episodes per season. So it's a very tight, kind of concise podcast. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be here amongst such titans of the industry. So thank you.
Thanks, Brian. And Christina.
Hi, I'm Christina. I host the Broke Girl Society podcast, and I co-host the Bet Free Life with Brian Hatch. I was a gambler for about 15 years, casino gambler. And when I entered recovery, I felt the lack of space for women in the recovery and the rooms that I was attending. And so I too was a fan of several of these podcasts that were very helpful for me in my journey. But I still wanted to bring the voices of women who are struggling with gambling addiction out into the open, spread awareness. And so that's kind of how I decided to start my podcast. And so my podcast focuses on women in recovery and different aspects of recovery that are connected with women. And so, yeah, that's me. And then I teamed up with Hatch and do the Bet Free Life on YouTube, which brings a different take to the podcasting. It's a visual podcast. And so that's been a really great experience as well. So that's my story.
Great. And so, Brian Hatch, maybe you step in here and tell us a bit more about the Bet Free Life and also your podcast.
Yeah, so I gambled for 14 years and I'd been in and out of GA and therapy and just thought I needed a different way to recover. So I talked to a friend of mine and he agreed to listen to me talk about my gambling, and we put it up as a podcast, and that's how this started. And that was about 8 years ago. And we're up to episode 324, 25, something like that. And it's been good. And I wouldn't have been able to do it without, people who are here and people outside of here who were able to come on and share their story about experiencing gambling harm. And so that's what most of the episodes are episodes of people just sharing their story. My story ran out, so I needed to get other people involved. And then we sort of branched out to interviewing people who help people who are experiencing gambling harm. So clinicians or people who work at the councils or helpline workers or anybody like that. So it's been a good run, and I'm so glad that you have us all here in one room. It's really cool.
Yeah, it is nice. Okay, and last but not least, Dave, talking about Fall In podcast.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dave Yeager. And I, next month, in just a month and a day, I'll be at 3 years in recovery from my gambling addiction. It's actually my second time into treatment. My first time was back in 2007. In 2020, after I'd gone through all this, I actually got to be a guest on some of the weekend podcasts that Brian would do, where we do kind of a group therapy session. And after one of them, I just pulled Brian aside and I said, hey, is there something we can do for the military and veterans community? Because I am a veteran. I actually fell into my addiction while I was on active duty, and had been, even before my relapse, had done some advocacy to help bring awareness to that. And Brian was like, yeah, let's do it. So, under Brian's wing, we developed the Fall In podcast, which focuses on military service members and veterans specifically, another population that I believe is underserved. And we've had people on who, veterans who struggle with addiction. I've had actually a veteran from also the UK, but then also people from advocacy from different councils, clinicians. I also had a retired Navy captain who was just dove in feet first to help in this community. It's all about raising awareness. So that's why we kind of breathed life into this.
Okay, fantastic. And so, these are, some of the podcasts that are out there to help each of you to get some guidance, inspiration around gambling issues, but they're not all of them. So in the show notes and in the blog for this episode, I'll do my best to put on links for all the gambling help podcasts that I'm aware of. So there's some others that their hosts aren't here. This episode is in real time being released around New Year's 2023. And so we thought what we would open this up to for discussion is, since this is a time when many of us take a bit of a kickstart with getting some change going, is for those of you who are wanting to kickstart addressing gambling for the first time in your life and making some real changes around pulling back, around what sort of ideas or inspiration each of you could offer. And then later on, we'll offer some guidance for those of you who've already pulled back and want to keep that momentum going. So who wants to just kick us off? For those who are thinking about making some changes with stopping or decreasing gambling, what do you have to offer them? Yeah, go Brian Ward.
Yeah, thank you. I think right off the bat, and I know that this is something that we've talked about before, that idea that change is very rarely linear, and it's not something that you are just going to get right off the bat, and it is acceptable to take a couple tries at it, to be able to back up, say, okay, Didn't work exactly how I hoped it would. I wonder what alterations could be made to push forward again. And I think that a lot of times we get really wrapped up in this kind of pass or fail mentality. And I think that the reality is that with something like this that's so important, I think it's a little too important to have a pass or fail mentality. I think it really is about persistence and really making sure that we are open to the idea of alterations when we see that they'd be of value.
Wonderfully said. Dave.
Yeah, I want to kind of bounce off that. First of all, that was perfectly put, Brian. I think that's so important to understand that it's not a one-time win on this or a one-time success on this. Sometimes it takes continuing to revisit it. One of the things that I want to say is, and this specifically applies to the group that I speak to, which is military and veterans, is around stigma and around the fact that you are, first of all, you're not alone. And the understanding of that is so important. I can remember when I was in my addiction thinking nobody could ever possibly understand what I'm going through. And the discovery that not only is that not true, but there are many of us out there that can help each other was a huge revelation for me. So that's part one, is reaching out to find that help. And then number two is, again, in the military, there is a huge stigma because if somebody admits to having a gambling problem, they run the risk of their careers being damaged and all that kind of thing. And what I would say to that is the risk of the damage that you can do to yourself and your family is far greater than the potential for risk for a military career. And if you catch it early enough and you say something early enough, you can start to move forward before that damage gets too great. There's so much fear around it, and stepping through that fear before going down the rabbit hole, if you will, is in my opinion, like extremely important.
Yeah, well said. Christina.
I think if you're listening to this and you're thinking about, what recovery is going to look like, I know for me it was super scary to think about what's on the other side of gambling. It was super scary to let go of gambling because it had become this toxic best friend in my life, and it was how I coped and dealt with things. And so I think what was really helpful for me, unfortunately, there's not a magic ball that tells us how this is going to go. It was being curious about what kind of life I wanted, what was next for me, like, and just understanding what was out there, what I was capable of the life that I wanted. And I needed to get curious about that, get curious about the help that I needed, and start focusing on what was going to work for me. I tried everything. I looked at everything. And I think Jamie pointed this out early on, is like, podcasts are great because you can put them in your ears. Nobody has to know that you're listening. You can kind of dip your toes in without like jumping all in to recovery. And you can kind of hear the different things that are out there to help you start recovery without, and that kind of takes a lot of the fear out of the unknown. If you're hearing stories of people who have crossed the bridge into recovery and how it's gone for them and what's worked for them and what's helped them, it's a great starting point.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Steven, you look like you're going to jump in.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in after that. That was a great point. I was also really scared coming into recovery. I remember for years, whether it was through drug addictions or through gambling addictions, like I felt like I had to fix this all on my own. I felt like I had built this huge mountain of lies and debt and shame and guilt and all this nonsense. I had to fix it myself because I just couldn't accept the fact that if this came out, that it would change the perception of not just the people around me, but then I would have to fully accept this myself. And I always had a hard time accepting that I was an addict, that I had these issues. I always thought that this was just another misstep or another screw up by Steve. But when everything came out, my wife caught the addiction for the second time. I finally decided I had to do something different, and I didn't know what it was going to look like. I didn't know what my life was going to be like, but I knew I had to make a change. And early on, I was able to start going to one-on-one therapy. And when I really was able to accept that I had this addiction, and to me, it's not just gambling or drug addiction or alcoholism. I think it's addiction in general. So being able to accept that I was an addict, I am an addict, and that there's nothing wrong with that. So one of the most impactful things I learned early on in recovery through my therapist, through one-on-one therapy, was when I went in there the first 5 minutes, he had mentioned, you had said shame about 10 times. So he asked me to identify what's the difference between guilt and shame. And I gave whatever I thought at the time. And he defined it to me as guilt is feeling badly about something that we've done, but shame is really feeling that we ourselves, me, myself, I'm a bad person. I'm not worthy of love. I'm not worthy of forgiveness. And that was just kind of a revelation to me. It's like I've made some bad choices. I've made some bad decisions, but I'm not a bad person. I can change. I am worthy of love, and you are worthy of love. You're not a bad person. We've just made a lot of bad choices and decisions, and that's just what they are. They're bad choices, and they've stacked up over time, and they became overwhelming, and we didn't know what to do with them. And like I said, I thought I had to fix this completely on my own because once it came out, it did. It changed everything, but it didn't change everything for the worse. My life is better than it's ever been. My mental state is better than it's ever been. I'm happier than I've ever been. And believe it or not, the relationship between my wife and I is better than it's been in over 10 years. We love each other more. We're more connected. We're honest about everything. Whereas I felt like I could not be honest even about who I was through the first 10 years of our life. And we've been married over 10 years now. And it's super scary at first, and you're not going to realize it at first, but just being as open as possible, coming out with it as early as you can, and accepting the fact that you're an addict, you're a compulsive gambler, or you're an alcoholic, or whatever it is. But that's not all you are. It's just part of your story. You can change it and use it to better yourself. I couldn't be happier to be a part of this community, and I'm happy to be a recovering compulsive gambler.
Mm.
Seems like
Yeah.
a good reason to go listen to all these podcasts. Those are some of the fantastic responses. And
Yeah.
I'll just kind of the best thing I've ever come across is the Johann Hari, which is the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And looking around this group, connecting with other like-minded people, like that's all that kind of changed. And a lot of people, I think Christina definitely touched on this, and Stephen, I mean, when you get connected, all of a sudden things change. And we tried to do everything ourselves, and that didn't work for me. And all I did was started getting feedback and help from other people, and that just changed everything.
Cool. And so, Brian Hatch, do you want to add anything for this, or do you want to kick us off into how to keep the momentum going?
I'll just, I mean, there's not much to add. Everybody, said great things. So, but I'll just add to not take it. Don't think you have to recover in one day. I wouldn't even about the word recovery. I would just worry about stopping gambling, just the physical act of stopping gambling today, and then go from there and not worry about everything else that comes along with recovery.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I'm putting you on the spot here, but Brian Hatch, what for you helped with that, just stopping one day at a time back in the beginning?
Stopping, I cut myself off from the world. I don't know that it was a healthy way to do it, but I cut myself off from the world.
Yeah.
And just sort of stayed in my box for a while to avoid physically going to the casino.
Yeah.
If I may, I think Brian just touched on something that is really important, which is that there isn't a cookie cutter way to do it, right? It's a lot of times finding out what your values are, what it is that's going to motivate you, or kind of incite the change that you're looking to make, and whether it would kind of be traditionally or blanket generally advisable, I think sometimes isn't necessarily the recipe for success. I think sometimes people can go a little unorthodox to find a path that works for them. And in the end, it really is about, were the benefits kind of outweighing the costs in that decision. And so I would maybe also acknowledge that sometimes unorthodox can work for people.
Yeah. And I think what I would just add on that is just, I think, recognizing that that if this problem has gotten out of hand in your life, doing the same that you've been doing is probably going to produce more of the same. And so it often does require something quite different, but probably something that those who've gone ahead of you and addressed it probably can show you around what different could look like, whether that means that you put up the blocks or the apps or self-exclude or you go to a GA meeting. Probably you're going to need to get some guidance around how to do this differently, because we all just with habits tend to do the same things over and over again. Or with this problem, I think we can get pulled very quickly back into doing the same thing over and over again.
I think
Yeah, and
that's
if I
what.
can,
Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to say, and if I can bounce off that just for a second, yeah, when you're stepping into a new way of looking at things and doing things, it can feel like putting on a new pair of shoes. It can feel really strange, and everybody's kind of alluded to this. If you can start to connect with people who are on or have been on the journey, you start to get some different perspectives on how they did it, and you can start to form your own way of doing it. It doesn't feel quite so uncomfortable anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say also, like, for sure, that's why it's important, just in the vein of this podcast that we're doing right now. Like, there's 6 of us here right now. Like Adrienne said, there's more out there. If you listen to one of ours and you're not connecting, you're not relating, listen to the next one, because like Brian said, we all recover differently. Like, what works for me is not going to work for Christina. That's not going to work for Brian and everyone else. Like, we all started over. Some of us got caught. Some of us decided to come into recovery. Some of us almost committed suicide. Some of us lost $5,000. Some of us lost 500 grand. Like, everybody's thing is different. But I just think that's why it's important to listen to each one, take what works for you, and just know that there's no one right way to do this. I mean, like, since the beginning, I've done maybe 1-2 meetings a week, and I'm 19 months in. But I've seen plenty of people that come in and do 90 meetings in 90 days, and they relapse on 91. I'm not saying not to do that, but everyone's recovery is different. What everyone does is different. So take a listen to everyone's. If you don't like mine, listen to Brian's. Listen to everyone's here. Just see what works for you.
Mm-hmm. And so what about that? Brian Ward, you kicked us off with just saying it's not linear, right? It can be a process in which pulls you back in, or you try something different. So for those who might have, they've started to pull back from gambling, they have a fear around having a relapse, or they just want to keep it going, right? Particularly even if it's not feeling like you want to do it anymore, but you want to make sure it keeps going. So like Stephen, you're 19 months in. What do you have to offer for people around how to just keep finding your path, keeping your momentum going? Yeah, I might pull on Jamie or Brian Hatch. Christina, if you have something to add.
Well, I can just jump in there and kind of go back to the, like being curious about what's next. Like that's for me, I placed my last bet March 6th of 2021. So, I'm 21 months in recovery. And for me, it was very much when I was gambling, I was very stagnant in my growth as a human being and, and just the things in my life. And so what's kept me motivated in my recovery, what keeps me going and keeps that momentum going, is just being curious about what's next. And I was a person that didn't even listen to podcasts before recovery happened for me. And it took me finding recovery, asking for help, advocating for myself and what I needed to start this journey. And through that process, I found podcasts and I found other resources that gave me the connection I needed, gave me the understanding that I needed, because there was still a lot I didn't know about recovery. There was still a lot I didn't know about addiction, because I didn't associate addiction with gambling. And so it really took me to a whole new level of just personal growth too. And so that keeps me motivated to just keep thinking about what's next and what I want. And that's what helps keep my momentum going.
I think there's an important point to add here too to that, is that when we first start in recovery, there's a level of excitement of, I'm not doing this anymore. I feel so good. I've engaged in this. I'm fully into it. This is great. And then all of a sudden the honeymoon ends and the pink cloud kind of dissipates and floats away. And all of a sudden you come into the reality that this is work, right? And in addiction, at least in my addiction, I mean, it was adrenaline on steroids. It was up, down, up. I was on a roller coaster. But recovery is more of a gradual incline. It's more of a gradual kind of growth process. And that can get boring, if I'm being honest. It can feel like it's boring, even though it's a fantastic process. It can feel boring because you're like, where's that spike? Where's that super good feeling? It's not there anymore. It doesn't feel good anymore. And it's a couple of things there. Number one, that connection to whether it's meetings or whether it's podcasts or whether it's whatever it is, that's where that connection becomes critical, because we're staying connected with the people that are doing it and seeing it and thriving in it. But we're also seeing the people who are just entering it and kind of staying in touch with that feeling of, this is what I wanted to get away from, you know? So in those periods for me where things started to feel boring, I anchored to my meetings. I anchored to the connection I had with between the meetings and the podcast and everything else. And it got me through that to the point where I don't need those dopamine or adrenaline spikes anymore like I did. So now I can anchor on and hold on to recovery itself as the process and the feeling better versus trying to get a hold of that, I need to feel good right now. So I think that's important to understand, is there can become a period where it can feel boring, but that's one of the best things that can happen, because we have the choice to fill it in with whatever healthy alternative we want to fill it in with.
Yeah, I think the other side of that is um, that it's very normal, and I would even say typical for people who are kind of transitioning into that sense of long-term recovery to go through that moment of boredom, where maybe motivation is being a little more challenged because you've been pushing for so long, right? And it feels like there's been a lot of action and a lot of persistence and consistency and all that. And then there comes a moment where it's not as needed, and I think it's really, really common and normal for people to kind of go, well, I mean, what is my motivation? And so I would say for people who may be experiencing that, I mean, that is going to be your own answer to provide, right? I can't tell every listener what their motivation for continuing is going to be, but I do think that, like Christina said, staying curious about it and really being able to say, yeah, is it still worthy? Is it still something that I'm committed to and seeing the benefit of these changes? And I mean, it was my experience that the answer was yes, pretty much every day, to continue that journey. And so thank you.
I have two things, at least for myself, that's worked for me to maintain past that pink cloud. For me, it's balance in recovery, and it's also finding purpose in recovery and outside of recovery. So I'll start with balance. For me, it's about finding my correct balance of my recovery activities as well as staying connected to family and life outside of recovery. So I've been a part of several groups. I used to go to one-on-one therapy weekly. I used to listen to podcasts like ours on a daily basis. Now I just listen to ones occasionally that come out. I have one group I'm active in right now that we meet once a week. I do one-on-one therapy maybe once a month, once every other month when I feel I need it. I've found a balance in that, in my recovery, and not overdoing it and not burning myself out. Also finding purpose in recovery. So it's good to help the next person coming in, the person that's just stumbling in, that's having difficulties, just coming into the room. Doing this podcast helps, but also finding purpose and joy outside of recovery, I find to be incredibly important, at least for me. So for myself, I had to get, not that I had, but I chose to get back into my health and fitness. I was really into health and fitness and weightlifting, whatever you want to say, when I was in my early 20s. And that's been huge for me. Not only has it been something I liken to recovery, where it's like in the beginning I couldn't see the changes, but over these 19 months I can look back and see how much my life has changed and see how much growth I've made. I've been really into my health and fitness for over a year and a half, and I've lost 30 pounds. I've put on muscle. I feel better about who I am. I feel better about what I look like, whatever. so finding stuff like fitness, music for me has been huge. I play and write music on a daily or weekly basis. So it's finding things, thanks, Brian, that you find joy in outside of recovery. Because I find a lot of joy and a lot of connection in recovery. But to me, it's like eventually life goes on and we have to find a balance between recovery and our action. Not, I don't want to say actual life, but life outside of recovery. And for me, it was finding joy in not just the time I'm spending with my family, but things for myself. So music, health and fitness is huge to me. Writing music, you know, that's what I found works for me. So find that in
Nice.
yourself. What do you enjoy? Art, hiking, I mean, whatever it is.
Nice, great. And just before, I know that you guys have lives and I don't want to take up too much of your time tonight. But I want to make sure, Jamie, Brian Hatch, is there anything further you wanted to add before we close up this first discussion?
No, I mean,
Jamie.
there's so many tools out there. You have it made. You can go to a meeting from anywhere on the planet with an internet connection. You can listen to podcasts. I mean, you can go on Reddit. There are so many resources out there that, I mean, I just wish I had those in 2010. So it's fantastic.
Cool. Brian, anything more?
Ditto.
Okay.
No, I think everybody said it pretty well. So
Cool. Well, then, what I'll just say again is so you can hear more of, I think, the wisdom, the humor, the real experiences that you've heard today with each of the podcasts or the YouTube channels that each of these wonderful people are creating and putting their heart and soul into. I'll put the links in the show notes. Anything that anybody else wants to say about how they can find your podcast, your YouTube channel? Nope.
You can find all of our podcasts probably anywhere that you find podcasts. And of course the Bet Free Life on YouTube. Hatch just like caught up on a bunch of episodes. There's a lot of great episodes on there where we bring different stories and different guests on. So
There's one in particular that just came out with this really cool veteran who's talking. Yeah, I think that one's worth looking at. No, they're all great episodes. I actually use them. I work part-time as an addiction therapist in the evenings, and I've actually used their episodes of the Bet Free Life because I do introductory courses to gambling, problem gambling, and as an addiction. And these guys have provided so much good information on that Bet Free Life. It's just absolutely amazing. And if somebody out there hasn't checked it out, please do, because you're going to get so much good out of that. It's just, it really is a good way to get a very casual look at gambling and just how serious it can be, because these guys don't take themselves too seriously, but they take the addiction very seriously.
Yeah. Okay. Well said. Awesome. Well, then I'm just going to thank all of you for joining me today. This was really fun to visually meet you all after I've been listening to your voices. Thanks for contributing to the discussion. And once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks for having
you.
us.